Good morning. It's always great to see you. Great privilege for me to be with you today. He said that I finished up here a few years ago. Most of you weren't alive then. And that's okay. I'm glad to be with you today because this is kind of the middle of the semester for you. And this is kind of a difficult, tough time to be in college. There's a lot of different things happening. There's a lot of different pressures and stress that you feel. And specifically at this point in the semester, you feel these things. You know, spring break isn't quite here yet, and you're kind of in the middle of the grind. And you know, a lot of people don't really understand or fully appreciate how tough it is to go to a Christian university. A lot of people don't understand the stress. I mean, some of your friends back home probably think that you just come up here and pray and sing Kumbaya, and then you get a piece of paper and you graduate. But today I was thinking, you know, it's so difficult sometimes. I remember when I was here as a student a few years ago. So I decided I would present to you this morning a top 10 list of difficult things about going to a Christian university. Being at a Christian university has its own unique challenges, its own unique difficulties. There are things that you experience here that people at other universities don't experience. And so today, I just wanted to share those with you in a top 10 format. Number 10 tough thing about going to a Christian university is annoying couples that walk barefooted and lie in hammocks together. That's very difficult. We don't want to see your feet. We just don't, okay? Number 9, difficult thing, all the freshman music majors pretending they're the next Lee student on The Voice. That's very difficult. And I have to, you know, obviously I tried to prepare some notes before I came here, and I had written this thing out, and I got in town last night, and I went to Dos Bros, and I'm in Dos Bros standing in line, and 6 dudes just start singing. In Dos Bros, together, in the line, at Dos Bros. Number 8, difficult thing about being at a Christian university, you get dirty looks from the pastoral ministry majors if you read Harry Potter books. Don't clap, because that means you like Harry Potter, and we will have an exorcism right at the end of this chapel. Number 7, difficult thing is you accidentally interrupt 3 devotional groups on your way to class. Keeping in mind that you will have devotions at class again, so that'd be great. Number 6, you are embarrassed because you can't remember what your dorm's theme verse is. Number 5, going to a church service or being mentioned by @eleeucrushes on Twitter counts as a date. This is how Leander Ridgway had 6 dates this whole semester, and so that's a difficult thing. Number 4, difficult, tough thing about being in a Christian university, trying to figure out what 70% of 5 chapel services equals. Other universities don't have to deal with this. By the way, it's 3.5, and the administration will do what they do with your school bill. They will round it up. You need to go to 4. Sorry. It's a pleasure being with you in my last chapel service. Number 3, at the end of the semester, your teacher evaluation sheet asks how you grew spiritually during this class. This is very difficult to answer. You know, it's tough because does your grade count on this? Like, do they factor that in? You don't know, and no, they say it doesn't. But what do you write? Algebra has really brought me closer to Jesus. I feel I have a deeper walk with Jesus because of human sexuality 301. No, that just feels weird. The number 2 tough thing about going to Christian university is listening to your RD seriously tell people they can't eat Tide Pods. By the way, if you eat Tide Pods, I'm not calling 911 for you. You have to deal with it. And the number 1 thing that's difficult is you have to explain to your friends back home what ring by spring means. Which, by the way, you've only got a few weeks left. It's starting to warm up outside. Now, it's tough. You know, you are in a tough situation sometimes, and dealing with those stresses and dealing with those different issues many times can be a challenge. And so I was thinking about how there's not really a time in your life, from the time you're in school to when you graduate, to you go into a profession or you start a family, there's not really a time where you're exempt from tough situations. And I make jokes about it, but some of you come here, some of you show up as students, some of you transfer in here, and you bring tough situations with you. So as I was preparing and thinking about this, I thought, the Bible speaks to tough situations. The Bible speaks to difficulty. And I wanted to share just a story with you that it's a brief story today, and it's a familiar story. But sometimes it becomes so familiar that we lose sight of the fact that it's a difficult story. It's a tough story. And when I start to read this story to you, many of you will already know how this story works out. If you spent any time in church or if you've spent any time around Christians, this is a familiar story to you. And so what I want to ask you to do is to just slow down for a minute. And instead of jumping to the end of the story and automatically knowing what happens, just take a moment and experience the difficulty with the characters in the story. In John chapter 11, verse 1, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now stop right there for a moment. There's this guy named Lazarus who's really good friends with Jesus. In fact, his family is close to Jesus. They've spent some time together. They've been together. They have a great relationship. In fact, they have a relationship that's so great that when they tell Jesus that Lazarus is sick, they don't even have to use Lazarus' name. They simply say, the one you love is sick. That's important to us today because being close to Jesus doesn't exempt us from difficult times. Being close to Jesus isn't a get out of jail free card. It's not we come to Jesus and we have a relationship with him and then we'll never have anything difficult or tough happen in our lives. But in fact, the one that was very close to him, that had great relationship with him, the one who had Jesus in his home and helped his ministry, and they shared meals together and they talked together and they were friends, the one Jesus loved was sick. And so they sent word to Jesus and said, Jesus, the one you love is sick. So after they sent the word, Jesus responds this way. Jesus says, this sickness will not end in death, but will end for God's glory. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not entirely comfortable with this. Like, Jesus says, hey, you've got a sickness here, and it's not going to end in death, but it's going to end up for God's glory. And the reason I'm not comfortable with that is this creates a new category for me theologically. This creates something for me that I kind of wrestle with. I'm cool with the idea that I got sick and then God took it and turned it around and got glory from it. But the idea going into it, knowing on the front end that this situation, this sickness is for God's glory is a struggle for me. I'm old school. The devil's supposed to bring the sickness and then God's supposed to fix it. But Jesus says, hey, on the front end of this, you need to know, this sickness is for the purpose of God's glory. I'm not good with that program. Let me tell you the program for God's glory that I want to be a part of. I want to win the gold medal at the Olympics in the snowboard, and I want to stand on the podium and get the medal, and then afterwards, I want the reporters to come up and be like, how did you do it? And I want to say, this gold medal is for God's glory. That's how I want God to get glory. Or I want to go on one of these TV shows and I want to win American Idol, and I want my album to go platinum, and then I want like TMZ or somebody to show up and be like, hey, you're a middle-aged white preacher, but your album went platinum. How did you do it? And I want to say, this album is for God's glory. But that's not the program that Jesus tells us about here. That's not what's happening in John chapter 11. Jesus says there are certain situations that are difficult, that are tough, that are tragic. But these situations are for God's glory. And when I encounter them, I'm just like you. I want to pray, Jesus, you have the solution. I need you to fix it. But sometimes we need to refocus the lens through which we see our life. And instead of just asking God, hey, God, how can I get out of this mess as soon as possible? We reframe our prayers and we say, how can the situation change me to bring more glory to Jesus? So they sent word to Jesus, the one you love is sick. And Jesus says, this sickness is not for death, but it's for God's glory. And then look what happens next in verse 6. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Wait a minute. Jesus, one of your best friends is sick. One of your best friends is on his deathbed. And there's nobody on the planet that can do anything about it except you. And you sit still for 2 days? Think about that for a moment. That doesn't sound right to me. I mean, if someone I loved was sick and I had the ability to fix it, I'd go to them immediately. Unless they ate Tide Pods. Then we might not. But Jesus sits still for 2 days. He doesn't move. Isn't it frustrating when God doesn't move on your calendar? I mean, we pray these prayers and we understand, we say, hey, God, listen, you can do anything, and I've got something I can't do, so why don't you step in and fix this? This doesn't make sense to me. 2 more days, Mary and Martha are taking care of Lazarus. 2 more days while one of them's tending to him and one's watching the road to see if Jesus shows up. 2 more days of watching their brother suffer. 2 more days of this person who's not a stranger to Jesus, but is very close to Jesus. And Jesus stays where he is. And you know what? I guarantee you felt that in your life. I guarantee that you've laid down at night about to go to sleep and you know you don't have answers for what you're facing tomorrow because you didn't have answers today or yesterday and you just need God to do something. It feels like God sits still. And it's so frustrating for us. It's so difficult for us. Let me remind you, God hasn't forgotten you. You're still on his radar. He's not up in heaven trying to figure out some great plan or what to do. He already knows, and he's orchestrating your life, the good things and the difficult things. He's pulling them together for his glory. And it may not be comfortable, and it may not be easy, but you can trust him. He's going to walk with you. Skip down a few more verses. What happens is Jesus talks to his disciples, and the disciples say, he says to the disciples, hey, we need to go down to here to see Lazarus. And they say, we don't want to go there. And they walk through this whole thing together. And finally, Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. Now, wait a minute. This tough situation just got worse. Okay, first of all, the one I love is sick. But then you sit still for 2 days. First of all, he's sick, but this sickness is somehow for God's glory, and you're not moving, so there's not a lot of glory happening in this thing. And now he's dead. See, that wasn't supposed to happen, Jesus. We sent word to you. You're supposed to come here, and you're supposed to do the prayer and sing the song and make spiritual face, and then Lazarus is healed. I mean, if you're Mary and Martha, if you're the disciples, look at this. Just earlier we see where Jesus healed a guy and he didn't even go to his house. He just kind of said the word and some stranger was healed. Now the one you love is dead and you could have done something about it and you didn't. And to make matters worse, Jesus says the worst pastoral thing you can say. He says, not only is he dead, but I'm glad I wasn't there. Now listen, I don't know a lot about being a pastor. I've done a few hospital visits in my life, but you don't go in the hospital and be like, hey, listen, I'm kind of glad you're here. You get fired as a pastor for doing that. Jesus isn't glad that Lazarus is dead. Jesus is glad that this situation is here because Jesus sees a bigger picture. And here's what he's saying. There's something so much greater, so much bigger, so much more involved than just the cool trick of healing somebody. The miracle that Jesus does is not just so that people can say, well, look, he turned water into wine. Look, he can walk on the water. Look, he can feed a lot of people. No, he says to his disciples, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you may believe. The miracles aren't just to bail you out of stuff. The miracles aren't just so that you can say, wow, Jesus is supernatural and cool, and I'm kind of regular natural and not cool. The miracles are so that you may believe. Because here's the thing. The more you believe, the more intimacy you have with God. And Jesus is saying, I'm willing to leverage every situation in your life, including your comfort, your health, all of the things that you're involved in. I'm willing to leverage those things in order to create greater faith in you, which will bring greater intimacy with him. And that's difficult for us because when you're in the moment, all you see is, my brother's dead. All you see is, you could have fixed this, but you didn't. And so Jesus goes to Lazarus. He goes to see him, and as he's on the way, the sisters come out to meet him. They walk out, and they say in verse 21, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And that's the same thing you've said sometimes. God, this is your fault. You could have fixed it. If you had just done something, it wouldn't be this way. People say this all the time to God. People who are Christians, people who aren't Christians, they say, God, my brother's dead, and if you would have just showed up, God, if you just would have opened the door and given me the job, then I wouldn't be in this financial situation that I'm in. God, if you just would have provided in this way, then I could have made things work, but you didn't do it. But then Martha says something that's tremendously powerful. She looks at him and says, even though I know you could have fixed this, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. What she's saying there is, in the middle of my difficulty, in the middle of my pain, I still can look at Jesus and have faith in him. And that's the kind of faith you have to have. No matter what you're going through. You got to see beyond the circumstance and say, listen, if this works out where I'm comfortable, if this works out the way I want it to, or if it doesn't work out the way I want it to, I still have faith in Jesus. And so Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again in verse 23. In verse 24, Martha says, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. What she's basically saying is what we say at funerals. Well, you'll see him again one day. Oh, you'll be in heaven with him soon. Oh, you'll be together in the sweet by and by. But Jesus says, no. It's bigger than that. It's bigger than just healing sickness. It's bigger than just doing a miracle. It's bigger than all these things because Jesus looks at her and he says these words, I am the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then Jesus asked them a question that he asked every one of us today. He says this, do you believe this? And Jesus asks you this same thing, not do you believe I can heal sick people? Do you believe I can make lame people walk? Do you believe I can feed 5,000? He's not asking if you believe in the cool magic tricks. He's not asking if you believe in a cosmic Santa Claus. He's asking, do you believe I'm the resurrection and the life? In the middle of the pain, in the middle of the difficulty, do you believe in Jesus? Because believing in the person of Jesus is the ultimate goal of the gospel. Mankind's problems started when they stopped believing in God in the garden. Mankind's problems started when they stopped putting their faith and their trust in him, and Jesus came to restore that broken relationship. And he's saying, look, in spite of all the great stuff, put that aside. Do you believe in me? And that's the question for you today. Do you believe in him? Now, in preacher school, they tell you should always finish your stories. You should never leave the Hebrew boys in the furnace, okay? If you're preaching a sermon on the Hebrew boys, you got to get them out of there. You should never leave Jonah in the whale, okay? If you're preaching on Jonah, you got to get him out of the whale. You should never leave Lazarus in the grave. And so to be a good preacher today, I'm not going to leave Lazarus in the grave. In fact, most of you kind of know how this story ends. Here's what happens. Jesus steps up and he says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus walks out of the grave, and it's powerful and it's unbelievable. But you know what? I don't even think that's the biggest miracle in the story. I don't think that's the point of the story. Because eventually, Lazarus dies. Think about that. In fact, everybody in the story eventually dies. In fact, everybody Jesus ever healed in the New Testament eventually died. And on that joyful note, we should pray and conclude. Now, here's the thing. Here's what I want you to see today. They're in the middle of this tough circumstance. But before Jesus goes to that tomb and says, Lazarus, come forth, Lazarus, walk out of that grave, before any of that happens, look at what happens. In verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. In verse 35, Jesus wept. Think about that for a moment. Jesus, who knew the future. Jesus, who knew in just a few moments he's going to walk up to that grave and say Lazarus' name and he's going to walk out. Jesus, who knew that this whole thing was kind of set up for God's glory. Jesus, who knew the end from the beginning. He didn't just get up there and say, okay, I'll fix it. I'm going to fix it right now. Hey, watch this. Nobody cry. Get your tears out of here. I'm going to fix this. He didn't do that. Because we have a God that will walk with you in the weeping. When you're in the tough, difficult circumstances, when you don't have answers, even though he knows how it's going to work out in the end, he still takes time to go with you, to be with you. Hebrews says we don't have a high priest that's not touched with the feelings of our infirmities. And what that means for us is that God associates with you. That he's not a God that's up here and says, I'm up here and you're down there, find a way to deal with it. No, he says, I'm a God that's up here and I'm coming down there to you. He walked with us. He felt the pain, and he walks with you today. No matter what your tough situation is, no matter how difficult it is, no matter how much worry and how much sleep you lose over this thing, one of the things the enemy wants to tell you is that you are alone and you're by yourself and that it's not going to work out and God's forgotten you. Jesus is walking and weeping with you. And he's going to go with you to the end of this thing. He's going to see you through it. He's going to show you that he is the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? Do you believe this when you look at your bank account and you're not sure how you're going to pay the bill? Do you believe this when you try to come up with a spring break plan because you don't want to go home because they keep fighting and they're talking about divorce? Do you believe this when people who you knew loved Jesus and had commitments to Jesus and you see what they're doing and they've walked away from the faith? Do you believe this? Do you believe this when your loved one says it's stage 4? Do you believe this? I want to encourage you today with this. God's with you. He's walking with you. He's not just trying to jump to the end of the story in your life, but he is actively walking and weeping and moving with you. And you can feel his comfort. You can feel his spirit wrapping arms of love around your heart and showing you, I'm here, I'm with you, you're not forgotten. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? Let's pray. God, we're so humbled today because Creator of the universe walks with us. We thank you that we're not a checklist, we're not some kind of mass production, but you are involved in the details of every student's life in this room. God, I don't know the situations they're facing, but you know the circumstance. You know what's happening. You see everything, all the intricacies, all the things that are going on behind the scenes. You know every burden. You feel every hurt and every pain. And I pray right now that in spite of the lies that the enemy and culture may bring, that you would remind those students in tough situations that you are with them, that you are near to them. When they hurt, you hurt. When they weep, you weep. And just remind them that, God, as you walk this journey with them, that ultimately the story of their life is a story that brings glory to Jesus. And God, I pray today for the heart that hurts, for the mind that's worried, that your Spirit would bring peace and calm. Lord, that you would bring a peace that passes all understanding. Lord, in the middle of turmoil, we can rest our heads because our hope is not in the cool things you do, but in the person of who you are. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you, Lee University. Thanks for letting me be with you today.